A man who was a wealthy farmer, but also described as paranoid and unstable, was put in an insane asylum. He was in the asylum for 7 years, until his death. Eventually, people around town forgot about this man. That was, until a summer day, almost 4 years later. An excavation crew was working in the basement, and they discovered bones buried in the soil. The home had previously been owned by this man. 6 bodies were eventually found buried in his basement, and they have never been identified. Hi, I'm Mindy. Welcome to the Missing Link channel. Each true crime case and unsolved mystery is just one missing link away from being solved. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a video and help us find that missing link. Who was this man? His name was Eugene Butler. He was born in December of 1848 in Royalton, New York. He died October 22nd, 1911, at the age of 62 in Jamestown, North Dakota. Butler came to North Dakota with a group of other individuals from New York in the 1880s, looking for a better life. At that time, what we know now as North Dakota was part of the Dakota Territory. North Dakota didn't become a state until 1889. This group from New York settled around Niagara, North Dakota, which is in the northeast corner of the state. In 1900, the population of Niagara was 392. It has been decreasing ever since. Currently, only 50 people call Niagara home. However, Niagara residents live in Grand Forks County. This county is the 3rd largest county by population in North Dakota, and the county grew in population from 1880 through the 1990s. Eugene Butler chose an area 6 miles northwest of Niagara. It was described that he occupied 3/4 of a section of land. This may not sound very large, but it is a great deal of land. There are 640 acres in a section, so this would mean that he would own about 480 acres. Assuming that sections today meant the same as back then, that equates to about 300 square city blocks. Butler began farming the land, and he eventually built a home on the land in 1882. When he first arrived, no one thought he was any different than just your average man who moved to the area during this time. At first, he was described as having many friends, but he never married and lived alone in his farmhouse. Over the years, Butler had gained substantial wealth and was a successful farmer. The next 10 years or so seemed to wear on Butler. He changed considerably during this time. He became a hermit, or someone who lives in solitude. Remember, he was on this large farm by himself. Perhaps so much time away from others affected his demeanor. Butler did have housekeepers and men who worked around the farm over the years. By the early 1900s, Butler was described as cheap, reclusive, paranoid, and unstable. He complained to his neighbors that his hired help was costing him way too much. His neighbors would even be awoken at night by Butler screaming and yelling, riding his horse at all hours of the night at what was described as breakneck speed. He told his neighbors that he was worried about trespassers, and he feared that someone was trying to steal from him. His nickname became the Midnight Rider. Can you even imagine hearing screams coming from outside your home on a farm in the middle of the night, and you look out your window to see your neighbor riding his horse at blazing speed, screaming his head off? Unfortunately, his behavior even got worse over time. In February of 1904, the Jamestown Weekly Alert and the Grand Forks Herald published an article about Butler. The article stated that from brooding over the hallucinations that all the widows and old maids in the county wanted to marry him, farmer Eugene Butler became insane and was committed to the insane hospital at Jamestown. The article continues. He is probably the wealthiest man who has ever been committed to an asylum from this county, his property being valued at between $40,000 to $50,000. The article also describes Butler's strange nighttime episodes. Butler claims that men are in the habit of coming to his home during the night, forcing him to get up and dress and take long walks and horseback rides. Butler was brought before the Insanity Board. This board decided that due to Butler's hallucinations and odd behavior, he was declared insane and sent to the insane asylum in Jamestown, North Dakota, where he would remain for the rest of his life. His strange behavior continued while he was in the asylum. He was always worried that someone was after him. Butler remained in the asylum for 7 years and died at the age of 62 on October 22, 1911. His estate was valued at up to $50,000. This was a huge amount of money at the time. After his death, his estate was split amongst various family members. His body was taken to New York and buried there. Years passed, and everyone seemed to forget about Eugene Butler. That was until June of 1915. A work crew was doing some excavation work under a home outside Niagara. The home was previously owned by Eugene Butler, and it had sat vacant for years. The new owner wanted to build a cellar. While excavating, they found bones a few feet under the soil. Upon digging further, they found a skull. The excavating was halted, and the authorities were called in. Over the next few days, they found the remains of 6 individuals buried in the soil under the home. At first, it was believed that the bodies were 6 males, 5 adults, and 1 between the ages of 15 to 18. However, this changed over time. It was later stated that 5 victims were believed to be killed at the same time, and 1 at a later date. The victims killed together were thought to be 1 man, 1 woman, and 3 children. Then a single male was killed later on. This is a completely different scenario than the one that was first reported. If there were 6 males, they all could have been killed at different times. However, if there was a man, woman, and 3 children, could this be a family that was killed together? The single body, the one that was discovered the first day during excavation, it was found under 3 feet of dirt. Then approximately 10 feet away were the 5 other bodies, and they were found together in one hole. It is believed that the single body was moved to the basement through a trap door from above. For the 6 bodies, it is believed that part of the foundation was removed to move the bodies into the basement. After the bodies were buried, the foundation was then restored. It looks like after Butler put these 6 bodies in the basement, he then restored the foundation. Upon examining the bodies, it was determined that the victims all died due to blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The skulls were all crushed. Butler likely used the same weapon or same type of weapon with each victim. Each victim had a small hole in the left side of their skull. It definitely had to be a sharp weapon used in committing these crimes. It was never mentioned that the victims were possibly shot. The victims were also all nude. There was no clothing or other items to help identify the victims. Butler likely removed their clothing before burying the bodies and destroyed their clothes and any other items that may help identify them. Perhaps he buried these items elsewhere or burned them to hide the evidence. After the bodies were found in his basement, Eugene Butler became known as the Great Plains Butcher. Butler's doctor from the asylum was later interviewed, and he seemed surprised with the news that 6 bodies were discovered under Butler's home. So perhaps we can infer that Butler didn't show signs of being violent while in the asylum. Maybe it was his mental issues that caused him to commit these crimes. Because if he was violent, perhaps the doctor wouldn't have been as surprised. It was believed that the victims were killed over a long period of time, perhaps years, from 1900 to 1904. So the authorities now had 6 bodies that needed to be identified. However, no locals had been reported missing. Neighbors and people in town could not figure out who the victims might have been. Identification was even harder since so much time had passed since these individuals were murdered. Remember, it could have been 15 years since these murders occurred before the bodies were found. And of course, this was over 100 years ago. Forensics has come a long way since that time. Sadly, none of these victims have ever been identified. As we stated earlier, there are conflicting reports as to whether these individuals were killed separately or whether some were killed at the same time. Could these victims have been housekeepers, farm workers, people passing through town, or even family members? Let's look at the possibilities. First, there was speculation that perhaps Butler was worried that a farm worker was going to steal from him. If this was the case, that might make sense for one murder, but not all 6. But then again, if he was suffering from a mental illness, perhaps this was an ongoing worry. Second, he did tell his neighbors that his hired hands were costing him a lot of money. Was he just an evil person that killed his help instead of paying them? Third, we know he suffered from hallucinations. Did this lead him to commit multiple murders? Perhaps he was even suffering from another mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia. Fourth, if he did murder a family of 5, perhaps the single person killed later on was someone inquiring about their missing family members. Could all the murders actually be related? Or were they all separate incidents? Remember, all the murders were blows to the back of the head. I can see this being accomplished if all the murders were at separate times. But if he was attacking a family of 5, I find it odd that the murders happened all the same way, and all with blows to the back of the head, with a sharp instrument. How was he able to overpower 5 people at once, 2 of them being adults? When he was in the asylum, he was always worried that someone was after him. This makes sense, because he was probably always wondering if he would get caught. Would someone find the bodies? Would someone realize that one of the victims were missing? And would they be connected to him? He was probably worried that the authorities would catch up to him and his crimes would be discovered. Or maybe he was being haunted by his victims. Today, DNA could help identify the victims. After the bodies were recovered, it is believed that they were kept at the sheriff's office in Grand Forks. But today, the case file is missing. However, this was in the early 1900s. Were case files even kept at the time? Also, the bones have been lost, stolen, or perhaps misplaced. I find it sad that these 6 victims were never given a proper burial. After the bodies were discovered, the story was still in the papers. It is stated that people came to the crime scene and stole bones as souvenirs. I remember this happening in the Villisca Axe Murder House. Who in their right mind would take human bones as a souvenir? And why would the bodies be left at the scene for days? Wouldn't the bones have been collected and taken by the authorities? If the excavation of the cellar didn't happen that day back in 1915, would these bodies ever have been discovered? Would we even know about the crimes committed by Eugene Butler? If any of these bones could be found, DNA could likely still be extracted from them, and their identities could be determined. DNA databanks have been increasing each year, with so many people looking into their own DNA. Could these victims still be identified? So who were these victims? The first body that was found had a small description. The single victim had a crooked nose, with nasal bone being bent slightly towards the left. Not a great description, but at least something. This victim may also have a potential lead to discovering his identity. Leo Urbanski from Minnesota thought he might be able to identify one of the victims. His brother, John Urbanski, disappeared from this area in 1902. Leo had received a letter from his brother John stating that John was in Niagara, North Dakota. He further stated that he was employed by a bachelor. This definitely fits the time period, the correct area. And could he have been employed by Eugene Butler? Do you think this is a possibility? This case is the opposite of what we usually hear in a true crime case. Usually, we are trying to determine who the killer is. But in this case, we know the identity of the killer. But we are unsure the identities of the 6 victims who came onto Eugene Butler's farm but would never leave alive. Due to the age of this case, the victims' families were probably searching for them for years, and they would have died not knowing what happened to their loved ones. What happened to these 6 individuals? Did any of them die together, or did they all die alone? What truly made Butler become a serial killer? What was his true motive behind committing 6 murders and burying the bodies under his home? Butler took the secrets to the grave with him. Thank you for joining me here today. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button so I know you enjoy hearing about true crime cases. Also, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified of my future videos. And follow me on social media as well to see what I'm working on next. As always, have a wonderful day. Watch out for each other and keep looking for that missing link. Love ya, and see you in my next video.